I moved into this old apartment complex about 6 months ago, and for the most part, everything was pretty quiet. But then it started. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was just imagining things, muffled conversations, what sounded like furniture being moved around late at night. I assumed it was just a new tenant in the apartment next door, but there was one thing that didn't make sense. I'd never actually seen anyone come or go. The parking lot was always empty, the hallway always quiet. Still, I figured I was overthinking it. One evening, while taking out the trash, I decided to casually ask the landlord about my neighbor. Maybe just to satisfy my curiosity. But when I asked, his face looked confused. "What neighbor?" he asked. "That unit has been vacant for months." My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the sound was from another unit, or I was just hearing things. But that night, the noises didn't stop. They were different now, closer, like whoever was there knew I was aware of them. I sat up, my heart pounding. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly, just listening. The air in my room felt heavy, like the silence itself was pressing down on me. Then, right as I was about to convince myself it was just my imagination, something else happened. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their nails along the other side of the wall. My entire body tensed. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone or something was in that apartment. I grabbed my phone, hesitating for a second before deciding to text my landlord. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I had to ask again. "Are you absolutely sure no one lives in the unit next to mine?" He didn't reply right away, and I wasn't about to sit there waiting while that sound continued. I forced myself to get out of bed and turned on every light in my apartment. The second I flipped the switch in my hallway, the noise stopped. Just silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, my pulse in my ears, staring at the wall like I expected it to move. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was my landlord. "Yeah, I'm sure." "Why?" I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. What was I supposed to say? "Oh, nothing. Just that I've been hearing someone inside the empty apartment next to mine for weeks." Instead, I just typed, "Never mind. Must be the pipes or something." I didn't believe that for a second, but I wasn't ready to deal with whatever this was. I just wanted to sleep, pretend I never asked, and hope the noises would stop now that I knew the truth. But they didn't stop. That night, as I lay in bed, something changed. The usual muffled sounds were gone, no whispers, no furniture moving. Instead, there was breathing. Soft, steady, like someone standing just on the other side of the wall. It was so close I almost convinced myself it was my own, but when I held my breath, it kept going. Slow, measured, too real. And then, just as I felt my body lock up in pure terror, I heard it, 3 knocks. Not on the wall this time. On my bedroom door. I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was screaming at me to do something, grab my phone, turn on the lights, run, but all I could do was stare at the door, waiting for whatever was on the other side to knock again. But it didn't. Instead, the handle rattled, just slightly, like someone testing if it was locked. My stomach clenched. I knew I had locked it before bed. I was sure of it. But in that moment, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. My apartment wasn't big, and the only way in was through the front door, which was still bolted shut. There was no way someone could be inside. And yet someone was. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The second the beam hit the door, the sound stopped. No breathing, no movement, just silence so thick it made my ears ring. My hand was shaking as I slowly got out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. I forced myself to walk toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. I don't even know what I expected to find when I finally reached out and touched the handle, but the second my fingers brushed against it, it was ice cold. I yanked my hand back instantly. That door led to my own apartment. There was no reason for it to be that cold. My entire body was tense, every instinct telling me not to open it. But I had to. I had to prove to myself that there was nothing there. So holding my breath, I turned the handle and pulled the door open just an inch. The hallway light spilled in, revealing nothing. No one was there. No signs that anyone had been. But as I stood there, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The air smelled different. Stale, like an old, untouched room. Like the apartment next door. I don't remember closing the door or getting back into bed, but somehow I did. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing. Every sound in my apartment suddenly felt suspicious. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the pipes, the occasional crack from the old wooden floors. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at my bedroom door, half expecting it to move again. But it never did. Eventually, the sun came up, and everything felt normal again. Almost. Because when I finally got up, I noticed something else. My front door was still locked, the chain in place. But the deadbolt? It was unlocked. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the lock. I knew I had locked it before bed. I always did. Living alone, it was just second nature. But somehow, at some point during the night, it had been undone. The chain was still latched, which meant no one had actually entered, right? But that didn't explain the knocks. The breathing. The way the air in my apartment had changed. My hands were ice cold as I relocked everything, double-checking, triple-checking, just to make sure. I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe I had been half asleep and confused. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. For the next few nights, I slept with every light on. The noises didn't come back. No whispers, no knocking, no movement. Just silence. Too much silence. It should have made me feel better, but instead it made the unease worse. Like something was just waiting. I never asked my landlord about it again, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes late at night, I still find myself listening. And every now and then, just barely audible over the hum of my apartment, I swear I hear it, slow, deliberate tapping, coming from the other side of the wall.
That night, everything escalated. The tapping started again, louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was followed by something worse. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being moved across the floor. I could feel my pulse racing, and every inch of me screamed to leave the apartment. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to stay, to listen. And then, through the dragging noise, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, as if the person on the other side of the wall was whispering, trying to speak directly to me. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the chill running down my spine told me it wasn't a friendly conversation. The voice was low, almost mocking. It sounded like a game, like the person knew exactly what would make me snap. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and, without thinking, I texted the landlord again, asking if he was sure no one was living there. But as I typed, a cold breeze swept through the room, and the tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, too silent. I stood there, staring at my phone, paralyzed, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. It was as if the apartment had been completely abandoned. I didn't know what to do next. My mind was racing. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I was imagining things. I kept trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. But when I turned off the lights and lay in bed, the silence felt suffocating. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. It felt like I was being watched. The air in my apartment was thick with tension, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't until I heard the faintest of footsteps outside my door that I finally lost it. I bolted up from bed and rushed to the peephole, but there was nothing there. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind replaying every sound, every feeling. Was it possible that I was just going insane? But then, the tapping began again. It was soft at first, like a finger tapping against wood. But it grew louder, and this time, it was accompanied by a faint dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. I knew at that moment that I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was in that apartment. I stood there, my breath shallow, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. It just continued, like the rhythm of something determined, something that was aware of me. Unable to take it any longer, I grabbed my jacket and headed straight for the landlord's office. I had to know what was going on. Maybe he hadn't been fully honest with me. Maybe there was something he wasn't telling me. I found him sitting behind his desk, looking as calm and collected as always. I asked him once more about the apartment next door, more urgently this time. His answer came with a confused look. That apartment's been vacant for months. You're the first to say anything about hearing noises. I couldn't believe it. But someone's been living there, I insisted, trying to hide the desperation in my voice. He shook his head, looking puzzled. No one's been there, he said flatly. Are you sure you're not just hearing things? I was left standing in his office, feeling like a fool. I wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't. He wasn't taking me seriously, and nothing I said seemed to make a difference. I walked back to my apartment, feeling a heavy weight in my chest. The thought of being alone in that place, knowing something was wrong, was almost too much to bear. But as I walked through the hallway, I noticed something strange. There was a faint light coming from beneath the door of the vacant apartment. I stopped dead in my tracks. The landlord had said no one was living there. But why was there a light? Was someone inside? I waited for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the crack of light beneath the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I gathered the courage to approach. I slowly placed my hand on the doorknob, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong, like I was crossing some invisible line. The light flickered, and the tapping started again, this time more intense. I pulled my hand back and rushed back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing, my body trembling. I had to know what was going on, but I was terrified to find out. The following morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the eyes of the building were on me. I went to work, but even there, I felt restless. When I got home that evening, I immediately checked the hallway again. The door to the vacant apartment was still closed, but the light was gone. I couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or more terrified. I stayed up late that night, waiting for something to happen. The longer I stayed awake, the more I realized that no matter how much I tried to ignore it, whatever was happening next door wasn't just in my head. It was real. I couldn't stop thinking about the words scratched into the wall of the vacant apartment. I know you're listening. Whoever, or whatever, was in there, they knew about me. And I had no idea why. I had no idea what was happening, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me, like I was in a trap. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to escape. Every time I tried to push it out of my mind, the noises came back, louder and closer, as if they were drawing nearer, waiting for the moment I would finally crack.
I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper, every faint tapping sent my heart into overdrive. I knew something was wrong, but I had no idea what it was. The apartment felt like a prison now. The walls seemed too thin, the air too heavy, and every corner too dark. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was there. Something was watching me. I had to know what was going on next door. I couldn't just sit there anymore, pretending like I wasn't hearing things. I decided I had to do something drastic. I had to get answers. The landlord's office was closed, and the building manager was nowhere to be found, so I made a choice. I would break into the vacant apartment. It wasn't the most rational thing, but my mind was running wild, and I needed to see it for myself. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my life any longer. I grabbed a set of tools, and in the dead of night, I crept into the hallway, trying to make as little noise as possible. The hallway was eerily quiet, but I could feel the tension in the air, like something was just waiting. When I reached the door to the vacant apartment, my hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The cold metal sent a jolt of electricity through my fingers. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should really go through with it. But then the tapping started again, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. It was like it was urging me forward, pushing me to open the door, to cross that line. I quickly picked the lock, and the door swung open with a soft squeal. My stomach dropped, and I held my breath as I stepped inside. The apartment was dark, much darker than it should have been. The faint light I had seen before was gone, and the air inside felt stale. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The apartment was empty, completely empty. There was no furniture, no signs of anyone having lived there. But the silence, it was oppressive. It pressed down on me like a weight. My feet felt heavy as I took slow, deliberate steps deeper into the apartment. I was trying to be quiet, trying not to disturb whatever it was that had been living next door. The floor creaked under my weight, and for a second, I thought I heard a faint shuffle in the corner of the room. I froze. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. Just empty walls, cracked windows, and dust. I took another step, and then I saw it. On the wall, written in what looked like dried blood, was a message. It was simple, but it sent a chill straight through me. I hear you. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my legs give out beneath me. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick joke. But then the light flickered on. I stumbled back to the door, desperate to get out, but before I could make it, the lights went out again, plunging the room into darkness. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The tapping started again, louder this time, like it was right next to me, closing in. I turned around, panicked, and that's when I saw it. A figure, faint, shadowy, like a mirage, was standing in the corner of the room. My body froze, and my eyes couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to run. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me. I backed up, almost tripping over myself, and stumbled toward the door. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't even grab the handle at first. Finally, I managed to yank it open and darted back into the hallway. My heart was racing, my body trembling all over. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slammed the door shut behind me and stood there, gasping for air. What the hell had just happened? I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't feel like a hallucination, it felt real. Too real. The messages, the figure, the tapping. I was no longer sure what was happening in that apartment, but one thing was for sure. I couldn't stay there any longer. I rushed back to my own apartment, locked the door, and sat on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. I was shaking uncontrollably. My head was spinning, and I couldn't stop replaying what I had just seen. Who was in that apartment? Who had left that message? The more I thought about it, the more my mind raced. The landlord had said the apartment had been vacant for months. So how was it possible that someone was living there? Or was I just going insane? I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but nothing could drown out the sound of the tapping. It echoed in my mind constantly. And then the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick it up. It was the landlord again. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice strained. "There's something you need to know about that apartment." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Just get out of your apartment. Stay out. I'll explain everything." The line went dead before I could say anything else. I stared at the phone in disbelief, trying to make sense of it all. What was going on? I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my things and left my apartment, the landlord's cryptic warning echoing in my mind. I didn't know what he meant by stay out, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. As I stepped into the hallway, I could already feel the temperature drop, and a chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't place, something that wasn't right. The building seemed different now, darker, as if the walls were closing in on me. I looked down the hallway toward the vacant apartment, and the door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. My feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the door despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around. I couldn't stop myself. As I approached, I heard it again, the tapping. Soft, deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. But this time, it wasn't coming from inside the apartment. It was coming from behind the door. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I stood there paralyzed. But then something happened. The door creaked open wider, as if inviting me in. And I couldn't resist. I stepped inside. The apartment was completely different from how it had been the last time I was there. The furniture was back, as if it had always been there, chairs, a couch, a coffee table. It all looked old, like it had been sitting and used for years. But what caught my eye wasn't the furniture, it was the message. The words were still there, written in blood on the wall. "I hear you." And below it, something new. "Now you hear me." My stomach churned, and my heart thudded painfully against my ribs. This was no longer just some weird coincidence. This was deliberate. I took a step back, and the door slammed shut behind me. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper into the corners of the room. My breath was visible now, even though I could see no reason for the temperature drop. The tapping started again, louder this time, right behind me. It was like a rhythm, almost familiar. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint at first, but it was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." My blood ran cold. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for the furniture, the walls, and the blood-stained message. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, as if someone or something was closing in on me. "Leave. Now," the voice hissed. Panic rose in my chest, and I rushed for the door, but it wouldn't open. My hands fumbled with the handle, but it was locked from the inside. My breath quickened, and the room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the shadows darkening. The whispering grew louder, frantic, now a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "You shouldn't be here." I slammed my shoulder against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Desperation clawed at me. I was trapped. I felt like I was suffocating in that small, dark room. But then the tapping started again, this time much faster, like frantic fingers on a window. The air was thick, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was pushing down on me. I dropped to my knees, unable to catch my breath. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, standing in the shadows. It was tall, its outline barely visible, but the feeling it gave off was unmistakable. It was watching me. I couldn't look away, even though my body screamed at me to run. It was like I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there watching. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again. The shadows had receded. The whispering stopped, and the door finally opened. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran down the hallway, out the door, and into the night. I don't know how long I was gone or where I went, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't be anywhere near that building. The strange thing is, when I went back to check the next day, everything was normal. The apartment was vacant again. The walls were clean. No blood, no message, no furniture, nothing. It was like the whole thing had been a bad dream. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of hearing those whispers in the dark. The landlord never spoke to me again, and I never saw him after that night. I moved out, and I never went back. I don't know who or what was in that apartment, but I learned my lesson. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting. I don't know what happened, and I don't want to know. I just want to forget.